Okay, it's time for us to move on to poetry. And for some of you, I know that makes you shudder, but please don't be frightened by it. I'm sure you saw that our approach to short stories was different from things you have encountered in the past. Well, our approach to poetry is probably going to be different from things you've encountered in the past, too. So, a couple of important rules for poetry. Number one, don't be afraid of it, okay? Writing things in poetry only means taking thoughts and capsulizing them. It doesn't mean, yeah, perfect meter, rhyme, all that kind of stuff. No. Okay, that's one kind of poetry, but we won't even be discussing meter and rhyme and those kinds of things. Okay, so that's not where we're going to be, so don't fear that. Okay, don't fear poetry at all. Okay, forget about all those times where you worked your brains out on poetry and were frustrated by it. That's not what's going to happen here. We're going to have some fun with poetry. Okay, now, second thing, when you read poetry, read it the same way you read prose. So read it by the punctuation. Okay, read it from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence. Doesn't matter what's on lines. Read it sentence by sentence, not line by line. It'll make a whole lot more sense to you. When you read it line by line, we don't think that way. We don't think line by line. We think sentence by sentence. So make sure you read it that way. Okay? You've done a great job on short stories, and I'm sure you'll do a great job on poetry. Relax, don't fight it, and don't try to do the stuff you did with it in previous classes. Our approach is different. We want to make you comfortable with it so that you won't feel like it's something you should hate. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about narrative poetry. And narrative poetry narrates. It tells a story. Okay, so why am I dressed in a baseball shirt, Oakland Athletics, and an Oakland Athletics hat? Well, my son lives in Oakland. But besides that, I'm going to recite a couple of poems to you. And the first one is a baseball story. It's entitled Casey at the Bat. Okay, but when you go to write about any of the poems that we're going to be talking about, or the ones that I give you the names of later on in the video, and you need a pencil and paper. So if you don't have a pencil and paper, put this on hold and get yourself a pencil and paper. Okay. But anyway, I'm going to be reading some poems to you that aren't in your book, but then I'll also give you some names of poems that are in your book so that you can read some things out of your books that are also narrative poems. But again, narrative poems narrate. They tell us a story. Okay? So there's another kind of poetry, other kinds of poetry that we'll look at next week, but this week we're looking at the narrative. So the name of the first poem we're going to talk about is called Casey at the Bat, and it's personally one of my favorites. It goes like this. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope that springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could but get a whack at that, they'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a pudding, and the latter was a fake. So upon that stricken multitude grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and they saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe on second and Flynn a hugging third. Then from this gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It bounded from the mountaintop and rattled in the dell. It struck upon the hillside and recoiled upon the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearings and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him when he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the wreathing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by that sturdy batsman the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches, black with people, I went up a muffled roar like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to that pitcher, and once more that spheroid flew. And Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two!" "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, "Fraud!" But a scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey would not let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light, and somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Okay, so that's Casey at the bat, one of my favorites. I love that poem. Okay, you all know, and you're very familiar with another narrative poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." I won't recite that for you. If you don't remember it, you can go online. You can Google it and read it. Okay, but you know, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." Okay, I could recite the whole thing for you, but we don't have time. But there's another poem I do want to recite for you, and it's another poem that I really like. It's called "The Cremation of Sam McGee." Again, we're dealing with narrative poems, poems that tell a story. Okay? There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that could make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home down the south to roam around the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold through the parka's fold, it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd closed, then the lashes froze till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed and the stars overhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in the strip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request." Well, he seemed so low that I couldn't say no. Then he says with a sort of moan, "It's a cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clear through to the bone. Yet 'tain't being dead, it's the awful dread of an icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that foul or fair, you'll cremate these last remains." Excuse me. A pale's last need is a thing to heed, so I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the streak of dawn, and God, he looked ghastly pale. He crouched on the sleigh, and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in that land of death as I hurried horror-driven with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise I'd given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, "You may tax your brawn and brains, but you promised true, and it's up to you to cremate these last remains." Now, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. In the days to come, though my lips were numb and my heart, how I cursed that load. In the long, long night by the lone firelight, while the huskies round in a ring howled out their woes to the nameless foes. Oh, God, how I loathed that thing. And every day that quiet clay seemed to heavy and heavier grow. And on we went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sing to that hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin. Till I came to the marge on Lake Labarge, and a derelict there lay. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice it was called the Alice May. I looked at it, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum. "Then here," said I with a sudden cry, "is my crematorium." Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying around, and I heaped the fuel higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you seldom see. Then I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I didn't like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens scowled and the huskies howled and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold and the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks and I don't know why. And a greasy smoke and an inky cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out and they twinkled about ere again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, I'll just take a peek inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked, and the door I opened wide. And there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile, you could see a mile, and he said, please close that door. It's warm in here, but I gravely fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge I cremated Sam McGee. Yeah, I know that poem by heart too, but I use a sheet just in case because it's kind of long. But anyway, okay, so these are narrative poems. I've given you, I recited 2 for you, and I mentioned a third one. Again, we had Casey at the Bat, The Cremation of Sam McGee, The Night Before Christmas. Here's a few others. Richard Cory on page 685. Richard Cory, okay. Dog's Death on page 552. Okay, Dog's Death 552. Nighttime Fires 567. Manners 593. Hazel Tells Laverne 608. Okay, again, poetry, not something to fear, not something to think about the way that you did it in the past. Rather, think of poetry as just, especially narrative poetry, as a story. Telling a story, read it by the punctuation, not line by line, and you won't have any trouble. Now, here's your question for this week. Your question is, email me the name of your favorite poem. Okay? Not necessarily one that you see in the book, just your favorite poem. Everybody has a favorite poem. Okay? You're doing great.